Here's the first thing that I ever built here on my YouTube channel. A bench that sits out front that nobody ever uses. Well, except for Peppa. The second thing that I built was this coffee table, and I don't know how it gets used because I built it to be sold. But the third thing that I built was this sort of entryway piece. It's a place where we keep our shoes, mail, phones, and coupled with this piece, backpacks, coats, hats, and other stuff. And we use this thing constantly. And for the past year or so, I've really been wanting to find the time to redesign and update this piece to make a better version, and more importantly, I wanted to make a nice set of plans for it so that other people could build themselves one as well. So let's do that. Funding for 4 Eyes Furniture is provided in part by supporters on Patreon. If you want to find out more about how you can support the show, check out the link in the description. Alright, so this version is going to be quite a bit different than the original. It's bigger, it has drawers, a lot more details, and it's all hardwood. Well, other than the drawer boxes. And I decided to make mine out of walnut and white oak, so that's where we'll start. By breaking down all of our white oak and gluing up a bunch of oversized panels. And obviously you could build this out of any combination or single species of wood that you prefer. So at this point, I'm making a total of 6 oversized panels. 2 of them will become shelves. 1 will become a bottom panel. Another will become 2 vertical partitions. This biggest one will become our top and 2 side panels. And this one will become 2 drawer fronts and 2 sliding doors. So due to the width of my panels, each of them will be made out of 2 boards. And for strength purposes, dowels, dominoes, biscuits, etc. aren't really necessary. That said, if your boards are particularly curved or cupped, you might throw in some just to help keep things coplanar. Personally speaking, I put them in the panels that would become my top and bottom, but none of the others. Okay, while those are drying, let's start working on the legs, and then we'll come back to this later. So here I'm roughing out some chunks of walnut, and we're not going to need nearly as much of this material. But something that you will need is templates. And this is often a point of confusion. People tend to think of templates as something that helps you build a piece. And while that's true, it's not really optional. You have to have templates to use the workflow that we're using for this piece. That said, that doesn't mean that you have to buy them from us. Basically, there's 3 ways that you can get templates. So with every version of our plans that use templates, your download will come with 2 file types for the templates, SVGs and PDFs. If you have a CNC, you can use the SVG files to cut your own templates out of whatever material you want. We always use 1/4" MDF. If you don't have a CNC, you can use the PDFs to print out a paper version of the templates and then use those to make yourself a set of templates. It's a little bit more work, obviously, but nothing you can't knock out in a couple hours. And finally, if you don't have a CNC and you don't want to deal with making them on your own, you can opt to purchase the templates and we'll cut and mail them to you. So regardless of how you get your hands on them, the first thing that we're going to use the templates for is deciding where in our material we want our leg pieces from, and then roughing them out on either a bandsaw or with a jigsaw. From there, we need to cut all of our joint faces. And this is really the one crucial part in how these legs are shaped. Or I guess they're the functional part. The rest is really more just a matter of aesthetics. But anyway, in the video plans, we'll walk you through every step of this process to make sure that you get it done perfectly. And while it is very critical, all you need to get it done is a table saw and a piece of plywood to use as a sled. Nothing too fancy. And actually, I'm going to stop talking about the plans now so that we can just focus on what we're doing in this video here. So the last thing that I'll say is, if you're interested in building this piece, or any of our others, we'll have a link in the description so you can check them out. And if you want to see an example chapter of what our plans look like, we'll have a link to that too. Okay, done. So at this point our joint faces are cut, but our pieces are still oversized chunks. But we're not going to refine them just yet, as I think you get a better result by gluing them up first and then shaping things after they're dry. So the only real trick here is getting good clamping pressure on these angled joints. And there's a few ways you can do this. The easiest is using something like these clamping blocks, which I'm not sure you can buy anymore, though there are other similar ones on the market. That said, as you can see here, you could also make your own out of plywood, and in fact we'll provide dimensional drawings for you if you choose to go that route. Or you could actually jig up something like this using the offcuts from your joint faces. And that's thanks to the fact that all of these angles are complementary. In any case, while those are drying, let's turn our attention back to our panels, which are dry by now. So after we scrape off our glue and give them a rough sanding, we can start bringing things down to their final size. And to do this, you can use anything that works for you. A square and a circular saw, a track saw, a crosscut sled, whatever. All that matters is that you cut things to size and do your best to have nice 90-degree corners on everything. Next we'll use a quick little jig that we made and a router to cut some rabbets on each end of our top and bottom panels. And I like to do this by clamping my panels back to back with their inside faces up so that we can cut our joinery onto both panels at the same time. And once that's done, we'll leave them clamped together and continue using our router to cut a few stopped dados. And these will eventually hold our vertical partitions. So we're almost ready to glue our box together, but before we do, I'm also going to cut in a few grooves that will eventually hold a pair of sliding doors. And we'll use a router to get this done as well. The next thing we're going to do to our box is add a rabbet in the back that will hold an inset back panel and add a small inside chamfer to the front for looks. And both of these are kind of similar processes and both are optional. So for the back, I'm going to use a rabbeting bit to cut a little 1/4 inch deep pocket all along the back. And you could do this before you glue up if you prefer, and you could use a table saw or a flat bottom bit with a guide. And if you did, you wouldn't have this problem of rounded inside corners. That said, we do, but to take care of them, you can do one of two things. Either sand the corners of your back panel to round them, or use a chisel to square up the back. Similarly, on the front, we're going to use a chamfer bit to add this little edge detail to the inside edge. And again, that's going to leave some rounded transitions. And again, you could have cut these in prior to gluing up, but to take care of them, I'm going to use a chisel, and then a bit of sanding will refine things. And as I said, both of these are optional. Obviously the front chamfer is just for looks, and for the back panel, well, you should definitely have one. I guess you don't technically have to. Or you could just leave it flat, and then slap on a piece of thin plywood and chamfer the outside edge, and you never really see it. I think the inset panel is a cleaner look though. Next we need to make a couple of vertical partitions. So we'll start by cutting them to length, which needs to match the distance between the dados that we cut a few minutes back. Then after we have that done, we'll use a piece of the offcut to set our table saw up to cut our tongues, which will go into our dados. And I always like to do this by sneaking up on the fit. And then once it's looking good on our test piece, we can cut it into our actual panels. So with those fitting nicely, next we need to rip both of these to their finished widths. And for me, this will be 2 different widths, since one of them I want to come all the way to the front of the chamfer that we cut. That's the wider one. And the other will be recessed behind our sliding doors. Then with that done, they still won't fit because, as you'll recall, we cut stopped dados, which means we need to clear out a little notch in our tongues so that the panels can slide forward to the place where we want them. Yeah, I'm good with this. Do you think if we got a world champion foosball player over here, we would just crank right through the wood?
I feel like they're more of a fast twitch.
I actually never really played foosball.
I played foosball at a soccer camp that I went to in the summers, and that was like the only time in my life that I played foosball.
Regularly?
And it was regularly for 1 week in the summer.
But what a week it was.
But yeah, for like 7 straight days, it was foosball and Mario Kart.
Which Mario Kart?
Nintendo 64.
What are the chances I could name every character from 64 that's playable?
Probably pretty good.
All right, you look it up. I'm going to try to name them. How many are there? 8? More than 8?
9, 10, 11,
oh my
12.
God. All right, Mario, Luigi. Damn it. By the way, if you want to hang out with us, or just feel like you are, then check out our new channel, Welcome to the Wood Shop, for more stuff like this. Okay, so by this point our leg assemblies should be good and dry, so we can get back to work on shaping those. So here I've got my templates clamped onto my assembly, and I'm going to trace out the entire shape of the legs. Then you can use a bandsaw or jigsaw to rough out the shape, making sure not to cut on the inside of your line. Then we can use some double-sided tape to stick our templates onto our assembly and use a router to finalize the shape. I like to use a template bit for the first few passes, taking light cuts to work my way down through the thickness of the piece. And then once I can't go any farther, I'll switch over to a flush trim bit and make the last pass. You also might notice that I'm only trimming along these edges. And that's because these are all flat, so they don't need any trimming. And then the back edges are end grain, which we want to avoid routing, and we'll get a cleaner result by cutting them with a track saw or a table saw later. I also like to float away on my router cuts at the transition areas here, as the router will tend to want to create tear out. And you can get a cleaner result by sanding the last little bit. And for this area, you really just want it to look good to the eye, so there's nothing functional about it. With that done, next I'm going to use another sled, just like we did for our joint faces, to finalize their lengths. Alternatively, you could use a track saw or a circular saw, or probably even a miter saw for this. Alright, the next thing that we need to do is cut our dados into our legs. And these will be what holds both of our shelves and our cabinets. And this is probably the hardest part of the build. That said, there are a few different ways you can get it done, some easier, some harder. Or if you really wanted, you could skip doing this completely. That said, things are going to get pretty technical in this step, so rather than explaining it here, in a minute I'm going to throw over to myself from chapter 17 of this set of plans, which is appropriately titled Cutting Dados and Legs. And in the plans, this chapter is about 12 minutes long, so I'm going to edit a slightly pared down version for this video. But even still, I think that this will give you a nice idea of what kind of detail we go into in the plans. But before we do that, to mentally prepare, and because it's actually necessary from a workflow point of view, let's cut our shelves to size. And since that's fairly straightforward, while I do that, let's take a minute to thank SimpliSafe for sponsoring this video. So SimpliSafe makes home security systems that are easy to set up and intuitive to use, and that make sure your home is safe. And they do this by covering your home comprehensively, both inside and out, thanks to products like their video doorbell and cameras in unison with glass break sensors and everything else that they offer. So after you design your system, it gets delivered right to your door, and it's really easy to set up yourself. And from there, your home is being professionally monitored 24/7, and if anything happens, their always-on team will call authorities immediately. And SimpliSafe's interactive monitoring service begins at only 50 cents per day. We've had our system for over 2 years now, and it's been great. We started off with window and door sensors, glass break sensors, cameras, and the basics, and have since expanded to include the video doorbell and the Simply Safe lock, which verifies that our house is locked using a timer and lets us keep track of who comes and goes, and even set unique codes for special circumstances. So if you've been thinking about getting a home security system, or even if you have a system that you think could be better, you owe it to yourself to give Simply Safe a look. There's no contracts and no hidden fees, and right now you can take 20% off of your system, and your first month is free when you sign up for interactive monitoring service, which will call the police if it's ever alerted to anything. So visit the URL that you see on screen here, or better yet, just click the link in the description, put a system together, and see if it's right for you. Okay, thanks Simply Safe. All right, I hope you're feeling refreshed, because next we're going to dig into that really technical section. So, plans, Chris? Over to you. This part of the build is going to be pretty tricky, so make sure you stay tuned to the end of this chapter, and we'll talk about some alternative methods you could use. Before we start cutting anything, we're going to do a bit of sanding on both faces. I'm going to go up to about 150 or 180 here. Then before we assemble, I'll do any finish sanding I need to do on the inside faces. But with them sanded now, I'm going to pick which orientation I want the legs to be in. So that's which will be the inside and outside faces in the final piece. And I'm going to go ahead and label my outside faces with an out. With the legs clamped together, next we'll mark the bottom edge of each of our 3 dados. And in this drawing, you can see the distance up the leg we're going to need to measure. And I'm going to mark an X on the side of the line that we're going to be cutting. That way we don't get mixed up later on over at the table saw. It also might be a good idea here to grab the off-cut piece of your shelf that I told you to save in the last chapter, and use that to mark what will be the top edges of your 2 dados, as this is going to help you when you're setting up the jig to make these cuts. Okay, so the simplest way to do this would be to use a dado stack set up to cut a dado that's as wide as your shelf panels are thick. That said, I know not everybody has a dado stack, so I'm going to show you how you can do it using a normal table saw blade and an 1/8 inch drill bit. That said, whichever way you're doing this, the same basic principles are going to apply. So ideally, you'll have a table saw blade that can leave a flat bottom cut. But if you don't worry, you can still do this. You just might need to sand a little bit extra. Anyway, then assuming you're using a normal 1/8 inch thick blade, you're going to need something to use as a spacer that matches that. So we'll use an 1/8 inch drill bit. Now, in a minute, we're going to set up our fence to make our establishing cut on the sled that we're going to use to make our dados. And remember that after we do that, we don't want to touch the fence. So before you do that, you're also going to want a few pieces of plywood that you'll use to set as fences. So I'm using 2 pieces that are about 2.5 inches wide and 12 inches long. And then you're going to want a third that's about 2.5 inches wide and 32 inches long. Okay, so next I'm going to grab the same piece of plywood that I had used a few chapters back when I was making my legs, and here I'm setting my fence to just a little bit in from 35 inches and establishing a new cut edge. So at this point the sled is basically 35 inches wide and 32 inches front to back, which is the same length as the long fence I just talked about. And it doesn't have to be exactly 32 inches, it just needs to be big enough that it can fit both of your pieces at the same time. Finally, the last thing we need to do before we start using our sled is to set our blade height to whatever depth you want to cut your dados. So I went for about 1/4 inch. That said, you don't have to really nail this setting. The important thing is that you lock it down so that all of the depths match from this point forward. By the way, if you were using a dado stack to do this, you're going to want to set that up before you establish the cut edge on your sled. So that means that you might want to raise the blade a few times to get through the thickness of your sled rather than making one super heavy cut. So the first step is setting up your sled to determine the angles that you're going to be cutting. So if you did everything perfectly, that would be 10 degrees off from the edge of your sled where the cut happens. But let's say that you weren't perfect, and instead of this angle being 80 degrees, it's actually 78.7 degrees. Well, the important thing is really that the angle of your cut is parallel with the ground, and we know that this foot will eventually sit on the ground. So the first step is to take your 2 pieces and set your feet flush with the cut edge, clamp it all down, and then clamp your 12-inch fences to the outside edges of your legs and screw it all down. You should also label the fences and your legs as AA and BB, That way you make sure that you're always using the correct piece on the correct fence. So all we're doing in this step is establishing the proper angle for cutting our dados. And at this point, your setup should look something like this. Next, we're going to need to determine where to set up our long fence in order to cut our bottom dado on both legs an equal distance up from the ground. To do that, I'm going to take one of my legs and position it so that the top edge of our dado cut is just hanging off of the edge on our sled. And I'm going to clamp the piece down there. Then I'm going to grab that off-cut piece of my shelf that I said to save and use that as a spacer to position my long fence. Basically, I'm just sandwiching it tight between the fence and the top side of my leg, and I'm making sure that the piece is parallel to the cut edge of the sled by using a large square. Then I'll clamp it down on both ends while I put a couple of screws in to hold it in place. Now, if you've never done this before, it might sound confusing for a minute, so I'm going to explain it, then I'll repeat myself when you see me actually making the cut, and that will hopefully drive the point home. So if we make our first cut at the top of the dado with our shelf offcut sandwiched between the fence and the workpiece, it's going to hit right on our mark. Then if we were to remove the offcut and rest our workpiece on the fence, we'll end up with a line right on our fence's cut edge, which would mean that the blade would clear out material 1/8 of an inch in this direction. So basically the dado would be 1/8 of an inch wider than we wanted it to be. But if we were to use our drill bit spacer sandwiched between the workpiece and the fence, it'll make it so that the outside edge of our blade hits on this line, and then the dado will be exactly as wide as our off-cut piece of shelf that needs to ultimately fit in the dado. So that's the theory, and here you can see me actually doing it, and it fits perfect. And this is up to you, but I recommend stopping the blade after each cut and using a clamp. It's a little tedious, but you'll get a better cut and it's just safer. So right now it's a very tight fit, but we still need to sand with 180 grit on our shelves, and then once we put some glue in there and with clamps, the whole thing should come together pretty nicely. All right. Next, I'm going to repeat the same thing on my other leg, and I'm not touching any of my fences to do that. Then with both of those done, I decided to do a quick little test fit to make sure that it was all coming together nicely. And it was looking good, so then I could proceed with my second setup for the upper shelf. And to do that, it's exactly the same as the first setup was, just moving my leg down so that the upper edge of my upper shelf dado mark is in line with the cut edge. And with my fence attached in position, again, I can make the cuts on both legs. Next, we need to make the huge recess that our cabinet's going to sit in. I hesitate to really call this one a dado. That said, the same sled setup is going to work for this cut. So we can detach our long fence and flip the piece around 180 degrees, and now we'll line up our mark with the cut edge on our sled, reattach our long fence, and this is going to establish the bottom of this recess. And here we're not going to use the whole off-cut drill bit spacer trick, and instead I'm just going to establish that first bottom cut. Then I'll take the workpiece over to our cabinet and mark where our top cut should be. From there we can remove the long fence on our sled, we're done with it now. And then I'm going to make a cut towards the top of where my recess should end, but I'm going to stay a good 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch away from where I think it should be at this point. And then I'm going to start the tedious process of clearing out all of the material between the two cuts. And this took me about 15 to 20 minutes of just going back and forth to clear out this over the course of about 70 cuts. So now you can see where a dado could save you some time, but we're only doing 2, so it's not that big of a difference maker. In any case, with it all cleared out, I'm going to go back over to my piece, and from here on out, I'm going to just nibble away at the top of the cut, checking for fit, and going back and forth until I have it just right. Another tip is that you might want to clamp a piece of plywood that's the same thickness as your sled to your table saw on the opposite side of the blade. And that's because you've already cleared out a bunch of material and your piece could tip, so this is going to prevent the workpiece from being able to rock or just making it where you accidentally cut too deep into the recess. And once you have those fitting good, if needed, you can do a little cleanup sanding on the faces of all of your dados. You can see here what mine looked like, but honestly, this is fine. You're never going to see them once you've glued it together, so don't worry about having a perfectly clean and smooth looking face here. Okay, so like I said in the beginning of this chapter, there are some alternative methods that you can use to do this. That said, I would encourage you to at least maybe watch this chapter again if you're feeling a little bit confused. The technique's a little tricky, but it's really not that hard when you give it a try. But I said I would talk about some alternative methods, so here they are. So first, you could basically do the same thing that we did for the top recess on the 2 dados for the shelves as well. And that didn't involve any drill bit or spacers or any of that stuff. We pretty much just cut an establishing line and then used our spacer block to mark where the top of the cut should be, and then you can make the cut again. So you wouldn't even need a sled to do that. You'd basically just use a miter gauge to do it. You just want something to hold your piece at the proper angle so that you're cutting a dado or a recess that's parallel to what the ground should be. Now, in theory, that should be 10 degrees, but as I said, you might have cut your joint faces off, so something could be a little different. So again, that's why I think this sled technique is kind of superior. You're going to get a better fit in terms of the sizing of your dados, but more importantly, it forces whatever that angle is, whether it's 10 degrees or arbitrary, to be parallel with the ground. If you wanted to just completely skip all of this together, you could actually just use screws. So you wouldn't cut any kind of recess, you would just have a perfectly flat inside face of your legs. And for the cabinet, you could do screws through the inside of the cabinet and into the leg, which you would never see. And then for the shelves, you couldn't really do that, but you could do pocket hole screws from the underside of the shelf into the leg. Alternatively, a little bit later in the build, you're going to see me using screws that go from the outside of the leg into both the shelves and the cabinet. And I did this just for reinforcement. So those I'm going to put in and cover up with either dowel, or you could also use plugs if you have a plug cutter. And that's going to be a viable alternative too. The downside to that is now all of your weight is resting on those screws, which for the cabinet is not a huge deal, because you're going to be able to get a few screws in there, so it should be pretty strong. But for the shelves, if you're going to put any kind of decent weight on that, that's a lot of weight just to be on screws. Not that the screws can't hold it, but there's a chance that actually pushing the shelf down, depending on how much material is above the screw that's inserted in it, it could make it want to pop up through the face of the shelf. So if you were going to do that, I would say bias that screw as close as you can get it towards the bottom of the shelf. I would also, on the cabinet, if I was going to do that, I might do some screws up through the side panels from the bottom panel just to help reinforce that. Make it so that it's not just, the glue that we did on that rabbet joint that's holding everything. Okay, let's move on. All right, YouTube version of Chris back here. Hey, everybody. And now that we have our leg joinery figured out and we have all of the major components of the piece, we can start doing a bit of assembly. So we'll start with the dry assembly where we'll attach our cabinet and our lower shelf to our 2 legs and clamp everything together. And by doing that, I can take actual referential measurements from my piece, which I can use to cut the rest of my base pieces to size. So what we need here are 2 stretchers that'll go in between the legs, and this vertical assembly, which will provide extra support for the shelf and the cabinet. Before we assemble, I'm also going to put a little edge detail on my legs, as well as do some prep work to help make the assembly go as smoothly as it can. And that includes a bit of sanding on some of the spots that I won't have access to afterwards, and countersinking some screws that'll go into my cabinet and shelves. And to make those, I'm using this portable drill guide from Rockler, which I trust quite a bit more than my actual drill press these days. So I use it whenever I can. By the way, in this shot, I'm cutting some plugs for my screw holes, and you can see why I'm not in love with our drill press. Also, if you don't have a plug cutter, you could use dowel for this. Alright, things are looking pretty good, but there's still quite a bit of work ahead of us, with the major things being making our drawers and doors. And let's start with the doors, since that's probably the harder of the two. So we're jumping back in time a bit here to before we glued things together, and you'll remember way back in the beginning of the video that we made an oversized panel for our doors and drawers. That's so we can get a good grain flow on these, since they're kind of the main focal point from the front of the piece. Anyway, all that means is that as I break this down and make my parts, I need to keep track of things with labels so that it all ends up in the same orientation in the end. But other than doing that, there's really nothing tricky here, and we're just getting ourselves to the point where our door panels are cut to size. Now, back when we cut our door grooves, I had cut the grooves in the top deeper than the grooves in the bottom. And the reason that I did this is so that we're able to take our doors in and out of the cabinet after it's assembled. Otherwise, it would basically be a one-time deal where you'd have to put them in during the glue up, and then they'd be stuck there forever. And I know that doesn't sound that bad. I mean, why would you want to take the doors out? But there's other implications of doing it that way, so this is better. So the first thing that we'll do is use an off-cut piece of our door to dial in our table saw settings to create the tongues that'll go into our bottom groove. With that done, next we need to figure out how high up the shoulder of our tongue on the top of the door will be. And we go over the precise way to do this in a lot more detail in the plans, but essentially the formula I came up with is that the shoulder distance equals the size of your opening minus 1/4 of an inch. Then we can set up and cut our top tongue. Then at this point, our door would still be too big, so the next thing we need to do is trim our top tongue, and I like to do this by sneaking up on a good fit, so no equations necessary. For the drawer boxes, we'll cover some of the general tips, but a lot of this comes down to the hardware that you go with. Now, I personally think that Blum hardware is the nicest, but it's also the most confusing to use. But if I'm spending the time to build a forever piece like this, I think it's worth it. And honestly, after you've done it a few times, it's not that much harder. That said, we go over all of the theory for this in a lot of detail, and while I wouldn't say it's easy to understand compared to their instructions, it's easy to understand. Alright, with everything fitting nicely, next we can cut our drawer/door pulls. Now you could do whatever you want here, but I opted for a negative space for a couple of reasons. First, I like the way it looks better. And second, because I want one door to be able to slide behind the other door, and having protruding handles would make that impossible functionally. Unless they were on the side like this, but I don't like that, so negative spaces it was. while we put the finishing touches on this one, I just want to invite you once more to check out our plans. We honestly work super hard on them, and while I would never say that ours are the best or even better than any other plans you'll find out there, I do feel confident saying that ours are at least as good. They really are like a woodworking course or a book. Seriously, the script for this one was over 20,000 words. That's not hyperbole. Don't worry, you don't have to read it though. We speak it. And there's an accompanying video the entire time. Also, if you like these videos and want to find out more about how you can support the channel, snag a t-shirt, a field notes booklet, and discounts on our plans, check out the Patreon link in the description. And to all of my current and past Patreon supporters, I know I say it time and time again, but seriously, thank you. I couldn't do it without you. And to those of you just watching who are interested in our videos, but not the plans or Patreon or any of the other stuff, I thank you too. And I'll see you in the next one.